Ilara Voss knelt to gather a bottle of floor cleaner that had spilled across the marble when Kane Drayton strode past and tossed a fistful of paper towels onto her cart without breaking stride, ordering her to scrub the coffee stain near the elevators before the new owner arrived. Inside the glass conference room above, 5 executives were laughing over the exact scheme they planned to use to bury a $40 million shortfall, congratulating each other on how easily the blame could be shifted onto the cleaning staff and the maintenance budget. Ilara said nothing. She wiped her hands on a paper towel, walked to the head of the table, and set down a folder with every one of their names printed across the tab. Then the door locked behind her, and none of them understood yet what had just happened to their careers. If satisfying reversals like this one keep you hooked, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the moment Ilara takes back what was always hers. Ilara had built her entire career on the discipline of watching quietly before she ever spoke, a habit she had learned decades earlier. Working overnight shifts in a research laboratory just to cover her own tuition. She remembered exactly how it felt to be looked through rather than looked at, to be handed instructions in a tone reserved for furniture rather than people, and she had promised herself long ago that if she ever held real power, she would use it to notice the things other leaders trained themselves to ignore. That promise was part of why she chose to arrive at Halston Vale Technologies hours before anyone expected her, dressed plainly enough that no one in the building would think to treat her differently than they treated anyone else. She wanted to see the company exactly as its own employees experienced it, not the version that would be assembled hastily once word spread that ownership had changed hands. Northline Holdings had spent months studying Halston Vale from a distance, and something about the numbers had never quite settled comfortably in her mind, no matter how many times the outside bankers assured her the figures were sound. The morning began hours before Halston Vale Technologies expected its new executive chair to walk through the lobby doors for the first time. Ilara arrived alone, dressed in a plain navy suit with no visible jewelry, having refused the town car that would have delivered her directly to a red carpet of handlers and cameras. She wanted to see the company as it actually functioned before anyone had time to stage it for her benefit, before the polish went on and the truth got tucked away. Near the service corridor on the ground floor, a cart belonging to Sienna Hale caught its wheel on a loose tile and spilled several bottles across the floor, and Ilara bent down without hesitation to help gather them. Kane Drayton rounded the corner with Mira Quill at his side, and the sight of a black woman crouched beside a cleaning cart told him everything he thought he needed to know. He dropped a wad of napkins onto the cart and pointed at a coffee stain near the elevator bank, instructing her flatly to have the floor spotless before leadership arrived, since the building could not afford to look cheap today of all days. Mira glanced at the unbranded cut of Ilara's suit and asked Sienna, as though Ilara were not standing right there, why a contractor was allowed to dress like she belonged among the guests. Ilara did not correct them. She only asked quietly whether they always spoke to employees this way. And Kane answered that people hired to clean did not get to ask questions of the people who ran the building. Sienna began to explain that Ilara was not part of her crew at all, but Ilara gave the older woman's arm the smallest, most deliberate touch, a silent request to let it pass for now. As the two walked on, Ilara checked the time on her phone and sent a short message to the auditors waiting outside the building, telling them to hold the schedule exactly as planned and lock every data system at the appointed hour. Sienna led Ilara through the service hallway to return the fallen bottles, and in the few quiet minutes it took to walk the corridor, Ilara learned that the cleaning staff had lost hours, lost benefits, and had spent the better part of a year being blamed for damage they never caused. Sienna assumed Ilara was a nervous applicant interviewing somewhere in the building, and she offered the kind of warning that people only give when they believe they have nothing left to lose by being honest. She said, "The company used to be a decent place to work, back before Harlan Crow assembled the current leadership team, and that everything afterward had curdled slowly enough that most people barely noticed until it was too late. Sienna spoke without bitterness, the way someone speaks about a fact of weather rather than an injustice. And that steadiness struck Ilara harder than any complaint could have. There was a practiced calm in the way Sienna carried herself, the kind that comes only from years of learning to survive disrespect without letting it curdle into something that might cost her the paycheck her family depended on. She described how the custodial staff used to be treated as part of the building's own foundation, trusted with keys to every floor and greeted by name in the stairwells, until a new wave of leadership arrived and slowly began treating labor as an expense to be minimized rather than people to be respected. Coffee breaks shrank. Schedules changed without warning. A handful of workers who had served the company for over a decade were let go within the same month, replaced by cheaper contracts routed through an outside staffing agency that answered to no one inside the building. Employees who asked too many questions about the numbers found themselves quietly reassigned or let go for reasons that were never fully explained, and those who stayed learned to keep their concerns to themselves. When Ilara stepped toward the employee elevator, Aria Langford blocked the doors and told her that contract staff were required to use the freight elevator, since it would not do to have guests of the executive floor riding alongside outside labor. Aria added almost as an afterthought that she would be calling the staffing agency if Ilara's attitude did not improve immediately. Ilara asked for her name and her title and repeated both back to her once, slowly, so there could be no confusion later about who had said what. Aria seemed almost pleased by the request, mistaking it for intimidation, working exactly as intended, and she straightened her blazer as though the exchange had already been settled in her favor. She added, with a thin smile, that the building had certain standards to uphold, and that those standards existed precisely so people would understand their place without needing to be told twice. Ilara simply nodded, filing the words away with the same quiet precision she had used to memorize vendor addresses and account numbers for months, and turned toward the stairwell instead of waiting for a response that was never going to come with any warmth in it. Riding up through the service stairwell, instead, Ilara noticed the folder left carelessly on a bench outside the executive conference room, its cover marked with the internal project name, Sweep. Inside were plans to eliminate more than 1,000 jobs in the weeks following the acquisition, paired with a plan to route tens of millions of dollars in unexplained costs through the maintenance and custodial budgets where no one would think to look twice. Near the bottom of a termination list scheduled for the coming week, Ilara found Sienna's name typed in plain black letters, filed beside dozens of others who had spent years keeping the building running while remaining invisible to the people who ran it. What Ilara understood in that moment was that the arrogance she had witnessed downstairs was not an isolated failure of manners. It was the visible edge of something far larger, a leadership team preparing to use the people with the least power in the building as human shields for a much bigger theft. She folded the corner of the page just enough to remember it later, set it back exactly where she found it, and continued toward the floor where the truth about Halston Vale Technologies was waiting to be uncovered in full. Standing alone in the stairwell for a moment, Ilara allowed herself a single breath of genuine anger before pushing it back down beneath the composure she would need for the rest of the day. She had seen companies cut corners before, had seen leadership teams treat budgets as puzzles to be solved rather than promises to be kept, but rarely had she seen cruelty and fraud so openly intertwined, each one feeding directly into the other. The workers scheduled for termination were not simply expendable line items to the people upstairs. They were, quite deliberately, the softest and safest place to hide a much larger crime. That distinction mattered to her more than the dollar figures ever could, and it hardened something in her resolve as she climbed the final flight toward the executive floor. What none of them yet realized was that Elara Voss was the founder of Northline Holdings, the investment group that had spent months quietly acquiring the majority of Halston Vale's shares through an intermediary firm. Because she rarely appeared in press coverage and had signed the early paperwork only as E. Voss, the executive team had built an entire mental picture of their incoming chair without ever once confirming it. Harlan Crow had simply assumed the new owner would be an older man from a banking background, someone he could charm over a long lunch and a longer bottle of wine. Elara had already grown suspicious of the company's financial reports well before she ever set foot in the building. Since profits kept climbing while operating, cash kept draining away, and half a dozen vendors somehow shared the same mailing address. She had chosen to arrive early precisely so she could see whether the rot was confined to a spreadsheet or whether it had worked its way into the culture itself. In the hallway outside the finance wing, a young analyst named Callum Hale noticed the unusual access badge tucked beneath her jacket and guessed correctly that she was connected to the acquisition team in some capacity he could not yet name. He told her quietly that financial files had been disappearing from the shared drive for weeks and that he had once tried reporting it to Human Resources only to be warned by Arya that the company could pursue legal action against him for improperly accessing sensitive data. Elara did not ask Callum to hand over anything he was not authorized to share, since she had no intention of building her case on a foundation anyone could later call theft. She told him only to leave every file exactly as it stood and to touch nothing further, no matter how tempting it might be to protect himself by saving copies. Using the authority that came with her position as incoming chair, she issued an order freezing every company server and routing full access to an independent auditing firm waiting downstairs. The freeze ensured that whatever evidence existed would be gathered cleanly in a way no lawyer could later dismiss as fabricated or planted after the fact. Callum watched her make the call and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tightly wound for months. The particular relief of realizing a burden he had been carrying alone might finally be shared with someone who intended to act on it. He had spent countless nights running the same numbers over and over, half convinced he was imagining patterns that were not really there, terrified of the possibility that raising his voice again would cost him the only job keeping his family afloat. Elara thanked him plainly, without theatrics, and told him that people who told the truth when it was inconvenient were exactly the kind of employees a company like this one could not afford to lose. Within minutes, an error message appeared on Mira Quill's monitor 2 floors above, informing her that her permissions to delete or modify financial records had been suspended without explanation. Mira assumed it was a routine technical glitch and moved on to her rehearsal notes, unaware that the freeze she had just triggered would soon become the backbone of the case against her. Elara stood outside the main conference room while the leadership team rehearsed the presentation they intended to give their new majority owner. And through the half-open door, she listened as Harlan instructed everyone to agree on a single unified story, blaming the shortfall on what he called poor oversight of low-level labor. Mira suggested pinning the irregular charges on cleaning, maintenance, and shipping vendors specifically, since those departments employed so many contract workers that no one would ever trace responsibility back to a single desk. Kane bragged that he had already arranged for certain hallway cameras to be disabled and for several vendor files to be quietly rewritten before anyone thought to ask questions. Arya assured the group that employee complaints would cause no trouble at all, since her department had classified nearly all of them as unfounded personal disputes rather than legitimate concerns. Sterling Quill reminded everyone that their combined severance and compensation agreements totaled more than $70 million, and that even an owner who disliked them personally would think twice before paying such a staggering price simply to remove them. Harlan continued describing his imagined version of the new chair as an easily flattered older man who would fold the moment he saw a polished slide deck and a healthy-looking margin. and the rest of the room laughed along, as though the outcome of the entire acquisition had already been decided in their favor. Mira added that men like that always wanted to feel important more than they wanted to feel right, and that a well-timed compliment about his business instincts would likely buy them another quarter of breathing room. Arya suggested every uncomfortable question as a misunderstanding rooted in the new owner simply needing time to learn how the industry actually worked, a strategy she said had never once failed her in 20 years of managing difficult board members. Sterling reminded the group to keep their answers vague whenever numbers came up directly, insisting that vagueness delivered with enough confidence read to most outsiders as expertise rather than evasion. Kane spotted Alara lingering near the door and barked at her to come inside and wipe down the table before anyone important arrived for the real meeting. Alara stepped in carrying a small stack of napkins, and the executives kept talking openly in front of her, confident that a woman pushing a service cart could not possibly follow, let alone remember, anything said about acquisition costs or shell vendors. Mira instructed her to dump the cold coffee and brew a fresh pot before, in her words, the people who actually mattered walked through the door. On the screen behind Mira, Alara caught a glimpse of a vendor list, and one address near the bottom matched a family trust registered under Mira's own name. Alara set the coffee carafe down gently on the table and said, in a voice too calm for the moment, that the rehearsal had been genuinely interesting and that she hoped everyone would deliver the exact same version once the meeting officially began. At the appointed hour, the independent members of the board filed into the room, and Harlan immediately ordered building security to remove Alara, insisting she had overheard confidential material simply by standing near the seat reserved for the incoming chair. Kane announced that her bag should be searched before she left, certain that whatever she had seen could be dismissed as a misunderstanding once security dealt with her. Alara did not resist or raise her voice. She simply placed the same napkin Kane had once thrown at her earlier that morning, flat on the table in front of her. A small, deliberate gesture that meant more than any protest could have. As the security officer approached, the board secretary stepped forward and said there was no need for that at all, because Chair Voss was already standing exactly where she belonged. The room went silent all at once. Alara removed her jacket to reveal the credential identifying her as Executive Chair of Northline Holdings, and board member Leora Fenn quietly pulled out the chair at the head of the table for her. For a moment, nobody moved, the silence stretching long enough that even the hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to grow louder, and Alara let it stretch, watching the color drain from one face after another around the table. She had learned long ago that people reveal more in the seconds after being caught than in any interrogation that follows, and she intended to remember exactly what she saw on each of their faces in that first unguarded instant. Harlan tried to laugh the moment away, insisting it was nothing more than a small mix-up caused by a front desk that had failed to notify anyone of an early arrival. Alara asked why the timing of her arrival had anything at all to do with how they treated a woman they believed to be a member of the cleaning staff. Kane offered that he had only been maintaining the standards the building required of everyone who worked there. Alara turned toward Sienna, who had just been invited into the room as a witness, and asked whether she was spoken to that way often. Sienna did not embellish or soften her answer. She said simply that it happened every single day, Chairwoman, and left it at that. A hush settled over the board members seated around the table, several of whom exchanged uneasy glances, clearly grasping for the first time just how far the gap had grown between the polished reports they received each quarter and the reality experienced by the people who kept the building running. Leora Fenn asked Sienna gently how long she had worked at Halston Vale, and when Sienna answered nearly 20 years, a visible ripple of discomfort passed through the room, the particular discomfort of realizing loyalty had been rewarded with contempt for the better part of 2 decades. Rather than issuing immediate terminations, Ilara announced that the meeting would continue exactly as planned, and she asked the executive team to present their prepared reports as though nothing at all had changed. The request unsettled them far more than an outright dismissal would have, since none of them could say for certain how much she had already heard or understood. Ilara opened the first folder from the stack in front of her, and the name printed across the tab read Harlan Crow. Harlan opened his presentation with practiced warmth, highlighting revenue growth, planned cost reductions, and what he called the unwavering loyalty of his leadership team. Ilara responded with a series of short, precise questions that left little room for evasion. She asked why revenue had climbed by 12%, while operating cash flow had fallen by nearly a third over the same period. She asked why 6 separate vendors shared a single mailing address on file. She asked how a cleaning contractor, employing only 14 people, had somehow earned a contract worth $11 million in a single year. Ilara also asked why a shipping vendor headquartered in an empty storefront had been paid nearly $5 million for services. No warehouse manager could actually describe when independent auditors called to verify the work. Mira answered that the payment structures were simply too complex for Ilara to fully grasp on short notice, a remark that drew visible discomfort from several board members in the room. Ilara remained composed and asked Mira to walk through each transaction line by line, and within minutes, Mira began contradicting figures she herself had signed off on months earlier. Kane tried shifting blame toward operations. Arya blamed clerical errors made by junior staff. And Sterling warned Ilara against drawing conclusions before consulting outside counsel. A board member near the end of the table, a quiet woman named Camille Thorne, who rarely spoke during meetings, asked why no one had raised these discrepancies during the last 3 quarterly reviews if the numbers were truly this far off. Mira stammered that the irregularities had only recently come to her attention, a claim immediately contradicted by her own signature dated months earlier on a document. Ilara slid gently across the table. Kane tried to interject with a story about a vendor dispute that had nothing to do with the question being asked, and Ilara let him finish before pointing out calmly that nothing in his explanation addressed why 3 separate companies filed paperwork from the same residential address. The room's temperature seemed to drop with every answer that failed to hold together, and even Harlan, who had entered the meeting radiating easy confidence, began shifting in his seat with the restlessness of a man watching a story he had told for years finally come apart in front of an audience that was no longer buying it. Ilara pressed a button, and the screen filled with findings already compiled by the independent audit team working 2 floors below. 3 of the shell vendors traced directly back to relatives of Kane Drayton, while 2 others funneled payments into a trust controlled entirely by Mira. The combined total of unexplained transfers came to $38.7 million, a figure that landed in the room like a physical weight. Harlan insisted he had known nothing about any of it, and Ilara responded by presenting an email bearing his own electronic signature, one that had personally approved waiving standard vendor verification procedures months earlier. She informed the room calmly that this was only the first of 5 folders sitting on the table in front of her. Callum Hale and Tessa Marlowe were brought into the room next, and Tessa explained how she had once flagged several suspicious vendors only to have her system access quietly revoked soon afterward. Arya had since placed a damaging performance review into her personnel file, one that conveniently appeared within hours of Tessa's original complaint. Callum described reporting irregular figures himself, after which Sterling sent him a warning letter suggesting he could face legal action and lose his entire retirement fund if he continued digging. Arya denied any form of retaliation, but Ilara produced internal change logs showing that Arya's own account had altered Tessa's review only hours after the complaint was filed. Sterling claimed that every action taken had been intended purely to protect confidential company information, Ilara asked why protecting information required erasing evidence of fraud rather than reporting it. The executives began turning on one another almost immediately. Mira accused Kane of creating the fraudulent vendors in the first place. Kane accused Mira of controlling where the money actually went. Arya insisted she had only followed instructions handed down directly from Harlan. Sterling claimed he had merely advised based on the limited information he was given at the time, though his voice cracked slightly on the word limited, as though even he no longer believed it. Watching them turn on each other so quickly, Ilara thought of Sienna's calm, matter-of-fact description of daily disrespect, and the contrast between that quiet dignity and this scramble of grown executives protecting themselves at any cost was not lost on her. None of them, she noted silently, had ever once turned to defend Sienna or Callum or Tessa the way they were now scrambling to defend themselves. Harlan raised his voice, arguing that none of them possessed the authority to act unilaterally without full board approval, as though procedure alone could erase what had already been proven. Ilara pointed out that all 5 of them had been perfectly willing to accept bonuses tied to inflated profits, yet not one of them was willing to accept responsibility now that the truth had surfaced. She then revealed that Project Sweep was never intended as a rescue plan for the company at all, but rather a scheme to eliminate more than 1,000 jobs simply to bury the missing money in the noise of a mass layoff. Harlan, sensing his grip on power slipping away, still managed a thin smile, reminding Ilara that his compensation package alone was worth $72 million, confident the board would never authorize paying such a price over what he still insisted was a simple misunderstanding with a member of the cleaning staff. Ilara turned to the independent counsel seated at the far end of the table and asked whether he would like to explain the termination for cause provisions written into each of their contracts. Independent counsel confirmed that every member of the executive team had signed agreements voiding severance in cases involving fraud, retaliation against whistleblowers, or the deliberate destruction of evidence. The server freeze Ilara had ordered earlier that morning had preserved logs showing both Kane and Mira attempting to delete files in the minutes before the meeting began. Sterling had received formal reports about the shell vendors months earlier and had chosen never to inform the board, filing the warnings away in a private drawer rather than risking the discomfort of confronting the people who signed his own paycheck. When independent counsel read that detail aloud, Sterling's expression shifted from practiced calm to something closer to genuine fear, as though he was only now grasping how thoroughly his silence had implicated him alongside the very people he had spent years quietly protecting. Arya had used the human resources system to intimidate whistleblowers and had falsified records to justify their eventual removal. And Harlan had personally approved the payments, endorsed the cover story, and collected bonuses built entirely on numbers he knew to be false. Ilara called for an emergency vote, and the board unanimously granted her the authority to terminate all 5 executives for cause effective immediately. She read each decision aloud in turn. Harlan Crow was removed for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and directing the cover-up of known wrongdoing. Mira Quill was removed for manipulating financial statements and personal enrichment through fraudulent vendors. Kane Drayton was removed for creating shell vendors, obstructing the audit, and intimidating staff. Arya Langford was removed for retaliating against whistleblowers and falsifying personnel records. Sterling Quill was removed for concealing evidence and weaponizing the legal department to shield misconduct. Mira sat frozen through the entire reading, her hands pressed flat against the table as though bracing herself against a physical blow, while Arya kept repeating under her breath that none of this was fair, that she had only ever done what was expected of her. Sterling reached for his phone as if to call outside counsel before realizing, visibly, that the firm he would have called had already been replaced that same morning. Kane snapped that Ilara was simply exacting revenge for being mistaken as a member of the cleaning staff earlier that morning. Elara answered that the mistake itself had cost him nothing, since it was the evidence that ended his career, though she admitted the mistake had shown her exactly who he was, long before the numbers ever confirmed it. All 5 badges were deactivated within minutes, severing their access to every system in the building at once. News of the terminations spread through the building long before the 5 executives finished packing their offices, carried floor by floor in hurried whispers and wide-eyed glances exchanged across cubicle walls. Employees who had spent years afraid to speak openly about leadership suddenly found themselves gathering in small clusters near the break room, trading disbelief and something that looked very much like relief, unsure whether it was safe yet to feel hopeful. Rather than allowing security to drag the 5 executives out in front of staff, Elara asked them to gather their own belongings under quiet supervision and to leave the building through the same service corridor they had once forced lower-level employees to use. Harlan paused at the door on his way out, warning that Halston Vale Technologies would collapse within a week without the 5 of them steering the ship. Harlan had spent years convinced the entire company depended on his personal relationships, and in his final hours in the building, he quietly encouraged several major clients to consider walking away if he were removed from leadership. He assumed, wrongly, that the threat of losing key accounts would eventually force Elara to beg him to return. Elara, however, had spent weeks preparing a transition plan long before she ever set foot inside the lobby that morning. She appointed interim leaders drawn from people the previous administration had spent years overlooking or actively suppressing. Ren Solis, previously head of financial controls, stepped into the role of interim chief financial officer. Reese Calder, a regional operations director with 2 decades of hands-on experience, became interim chief operating officer. Tessa Marlowe had her full authority restored and was named interim director of compliance, while an independent law firm assumed oversight of all legal matters during the investigation. Elara herself agreed to serve as acting chief executive for the following 90 days. Ren Solis had spent 9 years being passed over for promotions she was clearly qualified for, watching less experienced men rise past her while she quietly kept the company's actual books balanced behind the scenes. Reese Calder had once submitted a detailed proposal to fix the very supply chain inefficiencies Kane had spent years blaming on outside contractors, only to have the proposal buried without so much as a reply. Elara had read both of their personnel files during her earliest review of the company and had marked their names weeks before she ever set foot in the building, recognizing in their overlooked records the same kind of quiet competence she valued most. She announced a plan to keep operations stable and confirmed publicly that Project Sweep, the mass layoff scheme, would never move forward under her leadership. Harlan had spent the better part of an afternoon on the phone with old contacts hinting that Halston Vale's new ownership was unstable and unpredictable, hoping the rumor alone would be enough to shake loose a contractor or two before anyone bothered to check the facts for themselves. One client, a manufacturing partner who had worked with the company for over a decade, called Elara directly to ask what was actually happening rather than relying on second-hand gossip passed along through Harlan's old network. She personally called the company's largest client and explained the situation honestly, describing the fraud that had just been uncovered and the leadership changes already underway. Rather than canceling the contract as Harlan had hoped, the client extended it, reassured that Halston Vale had finally removed the people responsible for corrupting its own numbers. Employees who had spent years being dismissed as unimportant quickly proved they understood the company's actual operations far better than executives who had cared only about quarterly reports and personal bonuses. By the end of that same day, the factory's distribution systems and customer service lines were all running exactly as they always had. The company did not collapse. The only thing that collapsed was the myth that Harlan Crow had ever been irreplaceable. Harlan used what remained of his media relationships to leak a story portraying Ilara as a woman who had fired an entire leadership team simply because she resented being mistaken for a member of the cleaning staff. He hoped to paint her as reactive, thin-skinned, and unfit to run a company of this size, betting that the narrative would be easier for the public to swallow than the truth. Ilara declined every invitation to argue her case on television. Instead, she released a brief written statement that listed, without embellishment, exactly what the investigation had confirmed. The statement cited $38.7 million in unexplained transactions, deliberately falsified financial reporting, documented retaliation against employees who tried to raise concerns, an attempted deletion of evidence once the audit began, and a plan to eliminate more than 1,000 jobs purely to obscure years of missing money. She made clear that no one had been removed over a single unkind remark. They had been removed for building an entire system in which cruelty, deception, and abuse of power had quietly become standard practice. Several outlets tried to reach Ilara directly for a more dramatic quote, hoping to frame the story as a personal grudge rather than a corporate reckoning. But her office responded to each inquiry with the same brief, unembellished statement and nothing more. Industry analysts who reviewed the audit findings largely agreed that the numbers alone justified the terminations, regardless of how the leadership change had first come about. And within days, the narrative Harlan had hoped to spin quietly lost its footing under the weight of documented fact. A handful of columnists tried to keep the story alive by focusing on the elevator confrontation instead of the fraud itself. But public interest in that angle faded quickly once the scale of the missing money became widely understood. Regulators opened a civil investigation shortly afterward, and the board began the process of clawing back bonuses and equity that had been awarded based on numbers now proven false. Harlan's lawyers pushed back hard against the clawback, arguing the compensation had already been legally earned, regardless of how the underlying figures were later revised. But the termination for cause language in his own contract left him with little real leverage. Mira eventually agreed to a settlement rather than face a lengthy public trial, forfeiting a substantial portion of her remaining assets in exchange for closing the matter quietly. Kane fought longer than the others, insisting publicly that he had simply been following standard industry practice, though the paper trail connecting him to the shell vendors made that defense difficult to sustain in front of any judge. Ilara ordered the company's cleaning contractor to end the practice of cutting hours and benefits to inflate its own margins. Sienna's entire crew was brought on as direct employees of Halston Vale, complete with proper insurance and an independent channel for reporting concerns that no single manager could quietly bury. Sienna was not handed an unearned promotion simply because she had helped Ilara that morning. She was recognized instead for the 2 decades of genuine experience she already carried, eventually taking a seat on a newly created Workplace Standards Council representing facility staff. Callum and Tessa both had their personnel files corrected, received back pay for the income they had lost to retaliation, and helped design a new internal reporting system meant to protect the next employee who noticed something wrong. Months later, Halston Vale Technologies finished restating its financial reports in full. The company absorbed a short-term loss in the process, but preserved its client relationships, its workforce, and its reputation by choosing transparency over another cover-up. Cutting the fraudulent expenses meant the company never needed to carry out the mass layoff originally planned under Project Sweep. Ilara never presented herself as some flawless hero standing above criticism. She still faced skepticism from certain investors, pressure from competing interests, and a steady stream of difficult decisions that came with rebuilding trust from nothing. Even so, the culture inside the company began shifting in ways employees could actually feel. Managers across every department were required to complete regular training on fair treatment of staff, and for the first time in years, performance reviews for leadership included direct feedback gathered anonymously from the people who worked beneath them. A quarterly report on workplace conditions was now presented to the full board alongside the financial statements, ensuring that no future leadership team could quietly treat its own employees as an afterthought. Staff gained access to an independent body for filing concerns, one that answered to the board rather than to any single executive. Leadership compensation was restructured to reflect ethics, workplace safety, and employee retention rather than short-term profit alone. On one ordinary morning, Ilara arrived early again, carrying 2 cups of coffee, one for herself and one for Sienna, just as she had many mornings since. While the two of them talked near the service corridor, Ilara accidentally spilled a small amount of coffee across the counter. Sienna reached for a towel out of habit, but Ilara stopped her gently and wiped it up herself without a second thought. A new employee walking past recognized Ilara and rushed to greet the chair with visible nervousness, and Ilara simply smiled, waving off the formality, and kept talking to Sienna the way 2 colleagues naturally would. Sienna mentioned almost in passing that her granddaughter had recently asked what she did for work, and that for the first time in years she had answered the question with real pride rather than quiet resignation. Ilara told her that pride was exactly what every person in that building deserved to feel about the work they did, regardless of their title or the uniform they wore to do it. The 2 women finished their coffee slowly, in no particular hurry, while the building filled up around them with the ordinary sounds of a company simply doing its work honestly for once. Elevators rose and fell, phones rang somewhere down the hall, and a delivery driver wheeled a cart of supplies through the same lobby where everything had once been decided by who wore a suit and who wore a uniform. None of it looked remarkable from the outside, and that was precisely the point, since the most meaningful change Ilara had made was not a single dramatic moment, but the quiet, sustained decision to treat every person in that building as though they mattered, long after the cameras and the headlines had moved on to something else. They had once looked at a black woman standing beside a cleaning cart and assumed she held no power at all. Their real mistake was never failing to recognize Ilara Voss specifically. It was believing that anyone wearing a work uniform deserved less respect than someone wearing a suit. No one inside Halston Vale Technologies ever again confused where real authority sat in that building, and more importantly, none of them ever again mistook a uniform for a measure of someone's worth.